I still remember the first time I saw her. The image of that pale woman standing at the crossroads is etched into my memory like a scar. Her expressionless face, the way her hollow eyes stared, as if trying to peer into something deeper than my skin. It was a stormy Friday night, and I was driving home late after a long, grueling shift at work. The kind of night where fatigue settles into your bones, heavy and relentless. My job had drained me. Meetings, paperwork, people. I craved nothing but the silence of my apartment, a glass of something strong, and sleep. The highway was oddly deserted for a Friday, and heavy fog rolled in from the hills, suffocating the road. The streetlights barely cut through the haze, their beams muted like sickly moons. I turned on my high beams, but even those only made the fog look thicker, deeper, as though it wasn't fog at all, but some physical thing, dense and alive, shifting on the edges of the road. "Just keep going," I muttered to myself. As I neared the old crossroads just outside town, the one where the abandoned gas station used to be, I slowed instinctively. I don't know why. Maybe it was the fog, or the feeling of being completely alone, but something had settled over me, cold and uneasy like a pressure on my chest. It was then that I saw her. At first, she was just a faint outline in the mist, barely distinguishable from the swirling gray around her. A person? A shadow? I blinked hard, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, there she was, standing still in the dead center of the crossroads. As I crept closer, the details sharpened. She was a woman, tall and thin, wearing what looked like a long, tattered white dress. The fabric hung limp and lifeless against her, like something soaked in water and left to dry in a forgotten corner. Her hair was long and dark, hanging in wet strands that obscured most of her face. She didn't move. She didn't even seem to breathe. I slowed to a stop, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, the sound deafening against the oppressive silence of the fog. I knew I should roll down my window, call out, ask if she needed help. That's what a normal person would do, right? But something about her froze me in place. Then she lifted her head. Her face emerged from the curtain of hair, pale, far too pale, like skin that had never seen sunlight. Her features were unsettlingly blank, devoid of expression, but her eyes locked onto me, staring with a focus that felt predatory. I felt seen in a way I never had before, as if those eyes weren't looking at me, but through me, into every thought, every regret, every sin I'd ever buried deep inside. I couldn't move. My hands were glued to the wheel, my legs to the pedals. My brain screamed at me to look away, to drive, to do anything, but I couldn't. I could only sit there as she stared and stared, her stillness suffocating, the fog pressing in tighter around the car like it was waiting for something. Seconds stretched into minutes, or maybe longer. Time felt wrong, warped and distorted in her presence. Finally, her head tilted, just slightly, like a question mark carved into the fog. The movement was subtle, but it broke the spell. I sucked in a gasp of air I hadn't realized I was holding, slammed my foot onto the gas and tore away from the crossroads. The woman didn't move. She stayed planted in the center of the road, her face turning to follow me as I sped past. I swear I felt her eyes on me all the way home. By the time I stumbled through my apartment door, my heart was still racing, and my hands trembled as I turned the key in the lock. My entire body felt wrung out, like I'd run a marathon in my sleep. I tried to rationalize what had happened. It was just some woman, I muttered to myself, pouring a shot of whiskey with shaking hands. A prank, or a crazy person, that's all. But I couldn't stop replaying the moment her eyes had met mine, eyes that seemed to know things about me I didn't even want to admit to myself. I didn't sleep well that night. I'd close my eyes only to see her face, pale and unblinking, waiting for me in the dark. The next day was worse. I woke up feeling unrested and on edge. My body ached like I'd been hit by a truck, and every shadow in my apartment seemed a little too dark, every creak in the floorboards a little too loud. I shook it off and forced myself through the motions of breakfast and coffee, but the unease followed me like a shadow. The feeling didn't fade when I left for work. If anything, it got stronger. Every time I passed a crossroad or a streetlight, I'd glance nervously into the distance, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting. She wasn't, but the paranoia dug in its claws and stayed. Then the strange things started happening. It began with my phone. At midnight that night, I woke to the sound of it buzzing loudly on my nightstand. I grabbed it, squinting at the screen. No notifications. The buzzing stopped the moment I touched it, and a low static crackled faintly from the speaker. It sounded like whispering. Soft, distant, but deliberate. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. The whisper stopped, and the screen went dark. The following morning, my reflection looked wrong. Not dramatically, not at first, but enough to make my stomach twist. My movements lagged just slightly behind me. My expression seemed dull, and my eyes looked darker, emptier. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. At lunch, I told my colleague David about it. We weren't particularly close, but something about my rattled expression must have unnerved him enough to listen. "You look like hell, man," he said after I finished. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then described her, the woman at the crossroads. David's expression shifted immediately. His casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by something cold and wary. "Don't mess with that," he said flatly. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "My grandfather used to tell stories about her. They call her the Staring Woman. She's a ghost, a curse. People who see her don't last long." I stared at him, my skin crawling. "That's ridiculous." David didn't smile. "You say that now, but if she marked you, you're in trouble." "Marked me?" He shrugged, but his face was pale. "You'll know soon enough. She doesn't let people go easily." That night I felt the pull, the inexplicable urge to return to the crossroads. It didn't make sense. Why would I want to go back? But it was there, tugging at the edges of my mind like a whisper I couldn't quite make out. I resisted at first. I fought the urge for hours, pacing my apartment, biting my nails down to the quick. But at midnight, I found myself behind the wheel of my car, the engine humming softly in the stillness. And I was driving. Back to the crossroads. To her. The roads were empty, yet I couldn't stop myself from driving toward the crossroads. My hands gripped the steering wheel like a vice, knuckles white, as though some invisible thread was tugging me forward. It was maddening. I had no reason to go there. None. And yet I drove as though possessed, my foot steady on the accelerator while my mind screamed at me to turn back. The clock on my dashboard blinked 11:57 p.m. in a pale, ghostly green glow. I tried to fight the pull, forcing my thoughts elsewhere. What I had for dinner, the song on the radio, the mundane nothingness of my day. It didn't matter. My body was no longer entirely my own. It was as if I had become a passenger in my own life, reduced to an observer while something darker guided me forward. The fog was worse tonight. It clung to the earth in thick coils, twisting and swirling like something alive. The beams from my headlights didn't cut through it. Instead, the light diffused and bled, making it harder to see. The further I drove, the quieter the world became. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace. This was an oppressive, unnatural silence. There were no crickets, no hum of distant cars, not even the faint whistle of wind. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, almost as though it were smothering the world into stillness. When I arrived at the crossroads, the clock read 12 o'clock exactly. And she was there. The Staring Woman stood at the center of the intersection once again, a dark silhouette against the fog that curled unnaturally around her feet. She hadn't moved an inch since the last time I'd seen her, and yet something about her felt closer, impossibly closer. Her head was tilted at the same unnatural angle, and her eyes... God, her eyes. Her gaze locked onto me the moment I stopped the car. Even through the windshield, I could feel it, a searing pressure that bored into me, carving into my thoughts. She stared as though she knew me, as if she were flipping through the pages of my life like an open book. Every shameful moment, every dark thought, every time I'd ever lied or hurt someone, it was all laid bare under her gaze. It made me feel stripped, flayed to the bone, as though she could peel back my skin and see something rotting underneath. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. The engine hummed softly, the sound a weak contrast to the pressure of her stare. I wanted to scream, but my throat had closed. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, panic rising in my chest like bile. I felt like a child again, small and powerless, helpless before some vast and unknowable force. And then she took a step forward. The movement was slow, deliberate. Her dress, ragged, stained, dragged softly across the asphalt, the sound of fabric against the ground impossibly loud in the silence. My heart slammed in my chest, my pulse a pounding drumbeat in my ears. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, but my body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to drive, to move. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, a mouse trapped under the shadow of some great predator. Her face emerged more clearly from the fog as she moved closer. Pale, waxen skin stretched tightly over sharp cheekbones. Her mouth, too small and thin, remained closed. But her eyes were pits of something black and endless. Not simply dark, but void. Places where light and sanity were swallowed whole. When I looked into them, I felt myself unraveling. It was as if my very self, everything that made me, was being pulled toward her, thread by thread, sucked into those void-like pits. The whisper started again. Soft at first, almost gentle, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. But they grew louder, building into a chorus of voices all speaking at once, their words unintelligible yet sharp and urgent. It was as if they were calling to me, reaching for me through the fog, pleading and demanding all at once. I tried to press my hands to my ears, but I couldn't lift them. The whispers filled the car, filled my head, vibrating through my skull until I thought my brain might split open. "Stay," one voice whispered. Soft, feminine, yet wrong, like broken glass sliding across a mirror. "Stay." The woman was only a few feet from the hood of my car now. Her face was still, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burned into mine. My vision blurred. Tears welled unbidden, streaming hot down my face. The pressure inside my skull built to unbearable levels, and I heard a faint, sickening crack. The sound of something breaking, somewhere deep inside me. I knew then, with a horrible certainty, that if I didn't break free, I would never leave this crossroads. Summoning every ounce of willpower left in me, I forced my foot down on the accelerator. The tire screeched against the pavement, a sharp, desperate cry that shattered the silence. For a split second, her face twisted, only slightly, a flicker of something like disappointment crossing her features. And then she was gone. I tore down the empty road, my headlights cutting through the fog as though I were tearing through some thick, suffocating shroud. My hands trembled on the wheel, my breath ragged, and the whispers slowly faded into the distance, leaving only the sound of the engine and the pounding of my heart. When I finally reached the edge of town, the fog disappeared. It was as though I'd crossed an invisible boundary. The air was clear, the moon visible overhead, and the night had returned to normal. But the relief I felt was hollow. I could still feel her eyes on me, even now. That stare was burned into my mind, etched behind my eyelids like a curse. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing there, her hollow face, those endless black eyes. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was haggard and pale, my eyes bloodshot, my movements jerky and exhausted. I felt stretched thin, like my mind was beginning to fray. I spent the next day locked in my apartment, curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. I scoured the internet for anything about the staring woman. Most searches turned up nothing but folklore, urban legends passed down in small towns, blurry pictures and cryptic posts in forgotten forums. But then I found a story, buried deep in a thread that hadn't been active for years. A man claimed to have survived her gaze. His words were fragmented, paranoid, but the message was clear. To sever her mark, you had to bury something precious at the crossroads. Something deeply tied to your soul, an object that carried part of who you were. Only then, he said, could you sever her connection. But be warned, the man had typed in his final post. She doesn't like to let go. I knew what I had to do. That evening, I gathered the only object I could think of, an old silver locket that had belonged to my mother. I'd carried it for years, ever since she died. Inside was a photo of her and me when I was a child. It felt like a part of me, something precious and irreplaceable. By midnight, I was back at the crossroads. The fog was waiting, thicker than ever. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent. I parked the car at the edge of the intersection and stepped out, clutching the locket tightly in my hand. The cold air bit at my skin, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. And then I heard her footsteps, slow, deliberate, from somewhere deep within the fog. She was coming. The footsteps were soft but deliberate, each step a gentle tap against the pavement, like the ticking of a distant clock counting down. I couldn't see her yet, but I could feel her presence pressing against me, cold and heavy. My fingers trembled as I clutched the silver locket tighter. It was my only hope now, a thin thread dangling between me and whatever waited beyond that stare. The fog curled around my ankles, twisting and shifting unnaturally, like hands reaching from the ground. The silence deepened, the world narrowing to just me, and the thick, suffocating mist dot. And then she emerged, Dot. The staring woman stepped into view as if the fog itself had birthed her. She moved slowly, with no sound, no rush, as though she had all the time in the world. Her face was pale as bone, her long hair hanging like wet strands of ink over her shoulders. Her dress dragged behind her like a bridal train, frayed and stained with shadows. And her eyes, those black, hollow eyes, locked onto me the moment she appeared, as if she'd known I would come. My breath hitched, my chest aching under the pressure of her gaze. It was unbearable. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to do anything but look at her. But I couldn't look away. Her stare held me there, pinning me like an insect under glass, unraveling me thread by thread. The whisper started again, soft and insidious, clawing at the edges of my mind. Stay. The word echoed through my skull, vibrating behind my eyes. It wasn't just a word. It was a plea, a command, a promise of something worse. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, gasping as though the air had been punched out of me. My vision blurred, the world dimming, narrowing into her face. No, I choked out Dot. With a shaking hand, I pulled the silver locket from my pocket and fumbled to open it. The clasp caught for a second and panic shot through me like a lightning strike. She was closer now. I could hear the faint scrape of her dress against the pavement, could feel the chill radiating off her. It was as though the very air around her died. Stay, she whispered again. Closer. So close. The voice didn't come from her lips. It was everywhere, seeping into my bones like poison. I snapped the locket open. My mother's picture stared back at me. Her kind eyes, her gentle smile, the warmth of her memory. My tears fell freely now, splattering against the metal as I clawed at the earth with my free hand. The asphalt was rough and unyielding at first, but I dug anyway, desperate, blood pooling under my nails. Dot. Her footsteps stopped. I looked up. Dot, the staring woman, stood just a few feet from me now. Her face loomed inhumanly still. The those empty eyes locked onto mine with a hunger that twisted my insides. She tilted her head ever so slightly, her expression unreadable, but I felt the weight of it, like she was deciding something. "Stay," she whispered again, soft as a lover's breath. "No," I screamed. I shoved the locket into the shallow hole I'd dug, pressing it into the earth with bloodied hands. "Take it! Take it and leave me alone!" The moment the locket hit the ground, the whispers stopped Dot. The fog convulsed, rippling outward in waves, as though the earth itself had exhaled. The staring woman froze, her body stiffening unnaturally, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something cross her face. Not anger, not malice, disappointment. As if I had broken some unspoken promise, Dot. Her mouth opened slightly and a sound escaped, low and mournful, like the wail of a wind through an empty house. It grew louder, higher, piercing the silence until I thought my eardrums might burst. The fog churned violently, rising like a tidal wave around her, and I shielded my face as the ground trembled beneath me, Dot. And then she was gone. Dot, the fog collapsed in on itself, sinking back into the earth like water retreating from a broken dam. The silence returned, but it was different now. Less oppressive, less suffocating. I sat there on the cold asphalt, my hands shaking, my body weak, my breath ragged. Dot. She was gone. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the spot where the locket was buried. The crossroads were empty now, the air crisp and quiet. It was as though nothing had happened at all. But I knew better. The stain of her presence lingered, just beneath the surface, like ink smeared across the edges of my mind. I drove home that night in silence. The road was clear, the fog gone, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I told myself it was over, that I'd done what the story had said, and she was gone. But the unease never truly left. For weeks, I avoided mirrors. I couldn't explain why, but the thought of seeing my own reflection filled me with dread. The few times I glanced, I thought I saw something wrong. A delay in my movements, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Once, as I leaned closer to the bathroom mirror, I swore my reflection smiled when I didn't. The whispers, too, never completely faded. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them again, faint and distant, as though carried on the wind. Stay. It's always just one word, soft and pleading, and each time I hear it, I wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that if I looked out my window, I'd see her, standing at the edge of the street, staring up at me. Dot. Last night, I finally checked Dot. She wasn't there, Dot, but I swear, in the reflection of the dark window, I saw someone standing behind me, and she was smiling,